Hello everyone, welcome back. Thanks for watching once again. Today's topic, slavery in the New Testament. A lot of times you get the challenge from Muslims. It's come up a lot lately from what I've seen on YouTube. Why didn't Paul free the slaves? Why did Paul send Onesimus back to Philemon? Why didn't Paul encourage the early Christians to free the slaves? This type of thing. So in this video, I'm going to provide some background information regarding what Paul was dealing with there in the first century, what the early Christians were dealing with, and that will shed some light on the topic. If you like the short version, I'm going to give you 3 things to consider. If you like the long version, stick around. I'm going to read to you from some commentaries written by people who've studied life there in the first century under the Roman Empire. Okay, so 3 points to consider. In the first century under the Roman totalitarian state, freeing slaves was not an obvious good. And I think, how can that be? Well, stick around, we'll talk about it. Number 2, Christians lack the ability to influence Roman legal affairs. Now that should be quite obvious, but to some Muslims, it's not. Christians were called to a higher calling than the legal act of manumission. We'll talk about what that higher calling is. So, there are 3 things to consider. How did I get there? Well, let's see what some of these commentators have to say. All right, so we'll start with Douglas Moo here, the Pillar Commentary series. He's talking about the differences between slavery as we know it and slavery in first century Rome. He says, freedom or liberation was not in the first century world the obvious good that it is for us in the modern world. Many of us whose knowledge of slavery is determined by the institution as it existed in the antebellum United States South think of slavery in terms of the forced subjugation of a certain race of people. However, while many people in the ancient world became slaves by force, many others voluntarily sold themselves into slavery. Nor was slavery in the Greco-Roman world racially based. Slaves came from all races and ethnic groups. Moo continues, once set free, however, former slaves were on their own and often found it very difficult to make a living. Legal freedom would not, then, have been the obvious good in the first century that we would consider it today. Third, the New Testament Christians were a tiny religious group living within an all-powerful authoritarian empire. They lacked the power, and this is important, to influence government policy. More important, they lacked the categories within which they could conceive of what we would call social action. Finally, he says, most important perhaps, the early Christians did not understand their calling in these terms. If a Christian, quoting Thompson, if a Christian owned a slave, the highest duty to which the master could be called was not to set the other free, but to love the slave with the self-giving love of Christ. And then he refers to several passages there in Ephesians, Colossians, and 1 Timothy. Finally, from Moo, if slave owning is a moral evil, why doesn't Paul condemn it as such? First, as we noted above, freedom for the first century slave was by no means an unqualified good thing. A Christian slave owner who immediately released all of his or her slaves might be condemning many of them to poverty and starvation. Let's jump over to Barclay's commentary for a couple of paragraphs. What made it worse was that the slaves were deliberately repressed. There were in the Roman Empire 60 million of them, and the danger of revolt was constantly to be guarded against. A rebellious slave was promptly eliminated, and if a slave ran away, at best he would be branded with a red-hot iron on the forehead with the letter F, standing for fugitive, and at the worst he would be put to death by crucifixion. Paul was well aware of all of this, and that slavery was so ingrained into the ancient world that even to send Onesimus back to the Christian Philemon was a considerable risk. And 2 more entries from Barclay. Further, if Christianity had, in fact, given the slaves any encouragement to revolt or to leave their masters, nothing but tragedy could have followed. Any such revolt would have been savagely crushed, slaves who took their freedom would have been mercilessly punished, and Christianity would itself have been branded as revolutionary and subversive. Given the Christian faith, liberation was bound to come, but the time was not ripe, and to have encouraged slaves to hope for it and to seize it would have done infinitely more harm than good. And finally, what Christianity did was to introduce a new relationship between individuals in which all external differences were abolished. Christians are one body, whether Jews or Gentiles, slaves or free. In Christ there is neither Jew nor Greek, slave or free, male or female. All right, so how does all of this play out? Think of how this works with Paul and Onesimus. What are Paul's options? He can encourage Onesimus to continue in his fugitive status. Hey, slavery is a bad thing anyway. You ran away. Good for you. Keep it up. But the problem is Onesimus' life is in danger under the Roman legal system. That's a problem. Paul has to think about that, okay? What about the rest of the slaves? Paul could encourage them to revolt. The early Christians could all release their slaves. That's a problem too. because Christians can't influence the legal affairs of the Roman Empire. And if a Christian released a slave, guess what you've just done? You've created a fugitive slave. Somebody else can get that slave. The slave can be punished under Roman law. You just really don't have much of an option here. Here in the West, we would protest. That's the big thing, the sort of moral posturing. Think about what a protest would do under the totalitarian state of the Roman Empire. It's going to be crushed. Okay, so their options are really pretty limited. But Paul chooses the best option. And the best option is theology. Paul can't do anything about the legal circumstances of his time, but he can do something about the theology. He can say, this is what we're stuck with. We're stuck with this human hierarchy under the Roman Empire where slaves are viewed as lesser beings. But here's what Paul can do. He can say, all right, that's the case. However, theologically, there's no slave nor free, no Jew nor Greek, no male, no female. And so Paul can theologically eliminate these social classes and these social structures. And so then for the early Christians, these distinctions are distinctions without a difference. If you're an early Christian slave owner and you treat your family member with the love of Christ and you treat your slave with the love of Christ, what's the difference? Again, it's a distinction without a difference because you're treating people equally with the self-giving love of Christ, as Moo quotes in his commentary. So this is the option that Paul goes for. It was the best option then, and it's the best option now. Because as a Christian, you could live in any one of several countries around the world who still has this sort of a class distinction going on. Some humans are still viewed as lesser. That still happens. If you're a Christian there, what do? Do you revolt? Do you organize? No, you don't. That's what you're given. Okay, but you can deal with it theologically. You can treat the people around you equally by loving them equally with the love of Christ. But there's the other side of the coin as well. You can live in a free country where that people are not viewed on an unequal scale, like here in the West. People are viewed equally, generally speaking. But if you're a Christian and you're not loving people equally, you're not treating everyone equally with the love of Christ, then you're setting up these class distinctions in your mind, just like the ones that we see there in the first century in the Roman Empire. This is why this is the supreme calling that Paul gives. It's more important than manumission of slaves. In a legal context, the theology is more important. That's what Paul could change in his time. That's the important lesson for the first century Christians, and that's the important lesson for us today. And there's some background information about slaves in the first century under the Roman Empire and why Paul made the choice he did. Thanks so much for watching. I'll see you next time.